Hey guys, tonight let's do what we do best. Lower the lights, maybe put your phone face down, let the world quietly fall apart somewhere else. Tonight, we're going to drift back into history and spend some quality time with a man who had a very rare life experience. He was officially executed, legally dead, pronounced gone, and then, inconveniently, he wasn't. No screaming twists, no dramatic gasps, just paperwork, confusion, and a very awkward return to consciousness. So settle in, because this is one of those stories where history accidentally shrugs and says, yeah, that happened. Now, our man for tonight is named William Duell. And no, he didn't duel anyone. History loves that kind of irony. William Duell was born around 1724 in England, which means right away, life was already not off to a great start. 18th century England was not a cozy place. It was damp, it smelled bad, and everyone was constantly being executed for things that would now earn you a stern look and maybe a fine. William was not a king, he was not noble, he was not important, which ironically is exactly why this story works, because history only pulls this kind of nonsense on ordinary people. William grew up poor, very poor, the kind of poor where stealing clothes felt like a solid career move. And that, unfortunately, is exactly what he did. In 1740, at the age of 16, William Duell was convicted of theft, not murder, not treason, not even assault, just stealing clothes. And England, being England, decided this was a hanging offense, because of course it was. Now, quick pause here. 16 years old, executed for stealing clothes. This is not a quirky fun fact. This is just how casual state violence used to be. Anyway, William was sentenced to death by hanging at Tyburn, which was London's favorite place to kill people publicly. Think of it as an open-air execution venue with terrible reviews and no refunds. On the day of the execution, William was taken to the gallows. Crowds gathered, people chatted, children watched, because this was considered normal entertainment. William was hanged, he struggled, he stopped moving, and after the usual amount of time, long enough for everyone to feel satisfied, he was pronounced dead. End of story. Except, no, because William's body wasn't buried. Instead, it was sent to surgeons. Now here's where history quietly leans back in its chair and smirks. At the time, executed criminals were often handed over for dissection. It was considered an extra punishment. Not only do you die, but your body gets sliced up for medical students. Very polite society. William's body was placed in a coffin and transported to a surgeon's hall. And this journey took time, hours in fact, and somewhere during this slow, bumpy ride through London, William Duell did something extremely inconvenient. He breathed so at first no one noticed, because to be fair, corpses don't usually complain. But when the surgeons opened the coffin, they noticed signs of life, faint breathing, a pulse, a very much not dead teenage boy. And this is where things get quietly hilarious in a deeply unsettling way, because no one knew what to do. William had been legally executed. The sentence had been carried out, paperwork done, crowd dispersed, and yet here he was, still alive, still breathing, still technically executed. The surgeons did not immediately rush to help him, which feels on brand. Instead, there was debate. Some argued that since the execution had occurred, the law had been satisfied. Others worried that letting him live would cause legal problems, because apparently reviving the dead is one thing, but paperwork errors are unforgivable. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, which in this era means someone sighed and said, "Fine, don't kill him again." William was revived fully. He regained consciousness. And can you imagine waking up in a surgeon's hall after being hanged? That's not confusion. That's a full existential reboot. Now, England faced an awkward situation. They had a living person who had already been executed. And as it turns out, English law did not clearly cover this scenario. Because why would it? The authorities decided not to hang him again, partly because of legal ambiguity, partly because it felt excessive, and partly because people were starting to feel uncomfortable. So instead, William's sentence was commuted, not to freedom. That would be generous. He was transported to America as an indentured servant, which historically speaking was the "we don't want to deal with you" option. William survived his execution, survived transportation across the Atlantic, and then vanished into historical obscurity. No grand redemption arc, no dramatic speech, just life continuing. And that's what makes this story perfect for tonight, because there's no lesson, no moral, just bureaucracy colliding with biology. Now let's gently zoom out for a moment, because William Duell was not the only person this happened to. He's just the most famous. Throughout history, execution was not always precise. Medical knowledge was shaky. Timing was guesswork. And sometimes, people simply didn't die on schedule, especially with hanging. Contrary to popular belief, hanging doesn't always kill instantly. In fact, for much of history, it was messy, slow, and inconsistent, which meant that sometimes people survived. And when they did, everyone involved had a problem. Because if the punishment was death, and death didn't happen, do you try again? Some governments did. Others quietly pretended it never happened. And in William's case, England chose the classic solution: ship him somewhere far away and stop thinking about it. Now let's talk about the weird psychological side of this. Because imagine being William Duell, executed at 16, declared dead, waking up in a coffin, then being told, good news, you're alive. Bad news, you're going to America some forever. There are no records of his thoughts, no diary, no letters, which honestly makes it better for sleep, because we don't need emotional depth here, just the quiet absurdity. William Duell technically died once, and then lived on borrowed time, a walking clerical error, and history just let it slide. Now, before we drift onward, let's appreciate how deeply this story reflects the era. 18th century justice was not about rehabilitation. It was about spectacle, about making examples, about order through fear. And when that system malfunctioned, it didn't self-reflect. It improvised. William's survival didn't make anyone rethink capital punishment. It didn't inspire reform. It didn't soften hearts. It just created an inconvenience that needed to be relocated. Now, as we ease forward, we're going to meet more people like William. People who were executed badly. People who survived death sentences. People whose lives continued not because of mercy, but because of confusion. And we'll see a pattern emerge. A quiet one, a boring one. History doesn't change because of miracles. It changes because no one knows what to do next. So let's float gently onward, away from William Duell, the accidentally resurrected teenager, and toward another corner of history where death showed up late and everyone pretended that was fine. When you're ready, just let the story keep rolling. When we last left off, William Duell had inconveniently survived his own execution, embarrassed the legal system, and been quietly shipped across the ocean like an administrative typo. And what's comforting, if that's the word, is that he was absolutely not alone. Because once you start looking, history is full of people who were executed badly, not dramatically badly, not in a cinematic way, just inefficiently. And that inefficiency created one of the strangest problems governments ever faced. What do you do when the punishment works on paper, but not in real life? Now, execution in pre modern history was less of a science and more of a suggestion. There were rules, sure, there were traditions, but accuracy was optional. Hanging, for example, was wildly unreliable. Sometimes the neck snapped, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the person strangled slowly. Sometimes they passed out and woke up later with a headache and a very complicated legal status. Executioners were not trained professionals. They were often local workers, sometimes drunk, sometimes inexperienced, sometimes emotionally checked out. And nobody was out here doing quality control, which meant survival happened more often than you'd expect, just not often enough for anyone to plan for it. Now let's gently slide over to Scotland, because Scotland, historically, has always brought a special flavor of grim absurdity to everything. In the early 18th century, there was a woman named Margaret Dixon, and Margaret's story is one of those quiet historical events that feels fake, but unfortunately isn't. Margaret was convicted of concealing a pregnancy, which at the time was treated as a capital crime, because again, history was not emotionally supportive. She was sentenced to death by hanging. Margaret was hanged, declared dead, placed in a coffin, and transported to be buried. And somewhere along that journey, she woke up. This is the part where modern listeners expect screaming, or panic, or dramatic confusion. But instead, what followed was paperwork. Margaret was taken back to town, alive, breathing, very much not cooperating with the narrative. And now the court had a dilemma, because she had been legally executed. And Scottish law, like English law, was not prepared for resurrection as a procedural outcome. After some debate, thus, authorities decided that her sentence had been fulfilled, because technically it had. Margaret Dixon lived out the rest of her life, free, known forever after as Half Hang It Maggie, which is not a name you shake off socially. Now, what's fascinating here is not the miracle aspect, it's the reaction. No one asked whether execution was flawed. No one questioned whether the punishment was excessive. Instead, everyone collectively agreed that death had been attempted in good faith, and that seemed sufficient, because law at the time was not concerned with outcomes. It was concerned with process, and if the process had been followed, well, whatever happened next was between the body and God. Now let's pause gently on that idea, because it tells us something deeply important about historical justice. Execution wasn't about certainty, it was about ritual. The crowd saw the hanging, the state performed authority, the sentence was acted out. Whether the person actually died afterward was secondary, which feels unsettling, but also explains a lot. Now, not everyone who survived execution was allowed to walk free. Some governments were less chill about it. In France, for example, survival was often treated as a technical failure rather than a divine hint. If someone survived, they were usually executed again, with more enthusiasm. Because French law was not about to let biology undermine its authority. England, on the other hand, had a long tradition of awkwardly backing away from things once they became uncomfortable, and this is where William Duell fits perfectly. He survived, people noticed, and rather than rehanging him, the state quietly chose exile, which brings us to another layer of this story: transportation. Transportation was England's favorite loophole. It was cheaper than prison, cleaner than execution, and psychologically satisfying. You didn't die, but you also disappeared. For people like William, survival didn't mean forgiveness, it meant relocation. And that relocation shaped entire continents because many of the early European settlers in America were not heroic pioneers. They were administrative solutions, people the state didn't know what to do with. Now imagine the mental state of someone like William Duell after arriving in America. Executed once, survived, now starting over in a strange land. There are no records of him causing trouble, no dramatic crimes, no further scandals, which honestly tracks. Once you've been hanged and woken up in a coffin, you probably become very low maintenance. Now let's drift a little further into the cultural response to these stories. Because public reaction mattered, when people survived execution, crowds often interpreted it as divine intervention. God had spoken. Clearly, the person was meant to live. And governments, despite claiming divine authority, were oddly reluctant to argue with God in public, especially when the crowd was already uncomfortable. So survival became contagious. Once people saw it happen, they expected mercy. And mercy was not something early modern states liked to give. So the solution was often to remove the person quietly. No second hanging, no speeches, just gone. Which is why exile, transportation, and quiet release became popular alternatives. Now, there's something almost comforting about how boring this is. These are not epic rebellions, not glorious defiance, just systems malfunctioning and humans shrugging. And that's the tone history rarely advertises. Now, let's gently widen our lens again, because the 18th century was not unique in this. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, medical understanding of death was shaky at best. People were declared dead based on silence, stillness, lack of complaint, which is not exactly rigorous. Comas were misunderstood. Shock was common. Hypothermia confused everyone, and burials sometimes happened quickly, especially during epidemics, which meant accidental survival stories weren't rare. They were just quietly terrifying. Now, to keep things calm, we won't dwell on premature burial too deeply, because that gets unpleasant fast. But it's important to understand the fear. People knew this could happen, which is why safety coffins became a thing later on. It says bells, tubes, flags, all because someone somewhere woke up underground and made a lot of noise about it. But back in William Duell's time, there was no safety mechanism. If you survived, it was luck. And if you didn't, well, history moved on. Now let's circle back to execution as a concept, because one of the quiet themes of this entire story is how casually death was administered: for theft, for poverty, for inconvenience. And when death failed to show up on schedule, it didn't inspire humility. It inspired legal improvisation. Which brings us to the next figure we'll spend time with: a man who survived execution not once, but twice, and whose life afterward was even less impressive than you'd expect. Because survival doesn't guarantee success, it just guarantees continuation. So as we gently move forward, keep that in mind. These are not stories about triumph. They're stories about endurance, about the human body stubbornly continuing, even when society has already decided it's done. So take a slow breath, let your thoughts wander, and when you're ready, we'll ease into the next accidental survivor. Another person history tried to erase, and then awkwardly failed. If you nodded off for a moment, you didn't miss anything crucial. History was still being inefficient. So now that we've spent time with people who survived one execution, it's only fair that we meet someone who went a little further, someone who survived execution and then did it again, not heroically, not defiantly, just persistently. This is the story of John Smith of Tyburn, and yes, that is an aggressively generic name. History sometimes doesn't even bother with branding. John Smith lived in the late 17th century, which means he existed in that uncomfortable zone where medieval brutality was still hanging around, but people were starting to pretend they were civilized. John Smith was convicted of robbery, armed robbery technically, which meant the courts didn't hesitate. He was sentenced to death by hanging at Tyburn, same place as William Duell, because Tyburn was very busy. Now John Smith was hanged. The rope went on. The drop happened, the crowd watched. And like before, things didn't go exactly to plan. John didn't die quickly. He lost consciousness. His body went limp. The executioner did what executioners do, waited, observed, assumed. John was cut down and declared dead. And then, because this keeps happening, he started breathing again. Now here's where John's story diverges from William Duell's in a very telling way, because instead of being shipped off or quietly released, John was taken to a hospital, which sounds kind. It wasn't. Hospitals at the time were not places of healing. They were places where people went to continue dying. But indoors, John regained consciousness, slowly, painfully, confused. And this is where things get deeply awkward, because John was still under sentence of death. Unlike William, his survival was noticed immediately, publicly, and the authorities had a problem, because if they let him live, it would suggest that execution was optional, and that idea made governments very uncomfortable, so they decided to do it again. John Smith was scheduled for a second execution. No speeches, no reconsideration, no philosophical debate, just round two. And when the day came, John was taken back to the gallows. Same place, same ritual, and again, he survived. Now at this point, even the crowd was getting uncomfortable, because once is a fluke. Twice starts to feel pointed. People murmured. Some whispered about divine protection. Others just felt tired. And the authorities did something very rare. They stopped, not because they had a change of heart, not because they believed John was innocent, but because continuing to execute the same man over and over was starting to look bad. So John Smith's sentence was commuted, not erased, just downgraded. He was imprisoned instead. And that's the end of his story. No redemption, no fame, no meaningful contribution to history. Just a man who refused to die on schedule and was quietly removed from the narrative. Now take a moment to appreciate how underwhelming that is. 2 failed executions, and history barely remembers him, because survival alone does not make you important. What makes these stories linger is not the miracle, it's the reaction. Because every time this happened, the state had to decide whether it was powerful or reasonable. And usually, It chose whatever option involved the least embarrassment. Now let's gently reflect on why hanging was so unreliable, because understanding that helps everything else make sense. Hanging relies on several variables: the length of the rope, the height of the drop, the weight of the person, the position of the knot, and none of this was standardized. Executioners learned on the job. Mistakes were common. Corrections were rare. Sometimes the neck snapped. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the person strangled slowly. Sometimes they passed out and recovered. And when survival happened, it exposed a quiet truth. The system wasn't designed to kill efficiently. It was designed to look authoritative, which is a very different goal. Now imagine being an executioner in this situation. Your entire job is built on finality, and suddenly, finality doesn't happen. You can't apologize. You can't redo it publicly without consequences. You can't admit error, so you just improvise. And governments supported this improvisation because the alternative was admitting weakness, which they never do. Now let's drift slightly away from gallows and ropes and talk about the people watching. Because public executions were community events, families attended, children attended, vendors sold food, and when someone survived, it disrupted the rhythm. People weren't thrilled, they weren't inspired, they were confused, because execution was supposed to provide closure, a clear ending. Survival reopened the story, and people don't like unresolved endings, especially when they involve death. So communities often pushed for mercy, not out of compassion, but discomfort. It felt wrong to keep watching, which brings us back to that recurring theme. History doesn't soften because it becomes kinder. It softens because it becomes embarrassed. Now let's gently slide into another category of survival. Not hanging, not beheading. Execution by firing squad. Because you'd think that would be more reliable. You would be mostly wrong. Throughout the 19th century, there were documented cases of people surviving firing squads, sometimes because soldiers intentionally missed, sometimes because bullets didn't hit vital organs, sometimes because chaos intervened, and again, survival created a problem because bullets feel more final, more modern, more confident. So when someone lived, it felt worse. Governments responded in different ways. Some ordered another volley. Others declared the sentence fulfilled. A few quietly pardoned. And all of them tried not to talk about it afterward because the story wasn't useful. Now here's the sleepy truth. Most of the people who survived execution did not go on to live interesting lives. They didn't become symbols. They didn't lead movements. They faded because survival was not celebrated. It was inconvenient. And history, as a rule, only remembers what's useful, which is why we remember William Duell and Half Hang It Maggie and forget dozens of others. They didn't fit the narrative. Now, before we move on, let's gently address something modern listeners often wonder. Why didn't these survivals end capital punishment? Because capital punishment was never about accuracy. It was about control. As long as the performance happened, the system worked. And when it didn't, the system adjusted quietly, which is perhaps the most unsettling part. Now, as we continue drifting forward, we're going to encounter a slightly different kind of survival. Not someone who lived through execution, but someone who was declared dead, buried, and then returned. And unlike the others, this one left behind records, letters, accounts, because sometimes History accidentally documents its own mistakes. So take another slow breath, let your shoulders relax, and when you're ready, we'll float onward to the next not quite dead historical inconvenience. At this point in the story, death has already proven itself to be flexible, which is not ideal for a concept that's supposed to be permanent. So now we move away from gallows and ropes and into something quieter, something softer, something that happened not because of punishment, but because everyone involved was a little too eager to be done for the day. This is the story of Anne Green, and Anne's experience with death was not traumatic, it was administrative. Anne Green lived in Oxford in the mid 1600s. She worked as a domestic servant, which historically was code for overworked, underpaid, and blamed when anything went wrong. Anne became pregnant. The child was stillborn, which was tragic, and also, unfortunately for Anne, suspicious. At the time, stillbirths, especially among unmarried women, were often treated as murder because society preferred accusation to understanding. Anne was charged with infanticide, convicted, and sentenced to death by hanging. She was hanged in December of 1650. The rope tightened, her body went limp, and after a short time, she was cut down, declared dead, standard procedure. Anne's body was then delivered to the University of Oxford because executed criminals were often sent for anatomical study. Same deal as William Duell, different century, same indifference. Anne was placed in a coffin and transported. And then things got inconvenient. When the doctors prepared to dissect her, they noticed something. She was warm, which is not something you want your corpse to be. They checked for a pulse. It was faint, but present. Anne Green was alive. Now here's where this story gets oddly gentle, because instead of debating her legal status, the doctors decided to help her. They warmed her, they gave her cordial spirits, they rubbed her limbs, which sounds medieval because it is, and slowly, Anne woke up. She began breathing normally. She regained consciousness, and unlike William Duell, Anne had witnesses who cared, doctors, scholars, men who suddenly realized that killing her again would look extremely bad. Anne survived. And when word reached the authorities, something unusual happened. She was pardoned, not exiled, not imprisoned, fully pardoned, because everyone involved understood what survival implied. If God, or fate, or biology had intervened, continuing the punishment felt wrong, which is interesting because it shows us that mercy existed. It just needed plausible cover. Anne Green lived. She recovered. She eventually married. She had children. A remarkably normal ending, which almost feels disrespectful to history. Now pause gently here, because Anne's survival is one of the best documented cases of this phenomenon, and it highlights something important. Death was not always easy to identify. Medical criteria were loose, tools were basic, and execution did not guarantee certainty. People slipped through the cracks, and when they did, the response depended entirely on who noticed and how uncomfortable everyone felt. Anne was lucky. She was surrounded by educated men who understood the optics. Others were not. Now let's talk about burial, because burial was not always delayed. And that's where things get darker. Throughout history, people were buried quickly, especially during plagues, especially among the poor, which meant some people were buried alive, not often enough to stop the practice, but often enough to haunt everyone. There are recorded cases of coffins being reopened by accident or necessity, only to reveal scratch marks, broken fingernails, signs of struggle. We're not going to dwell on that. Just know that it happened, and that people knew it happened, which is why fear of premature burial became widespread in the 18th and 19th centuries. People began demanding waiting periods, wake rituals, observation, because the line between dead and alive was thin and sometimes crossed unintentionally. Now here's the calm, boring truth. Most people who were declared dead and later revived didn't become legends. They didn't change laws. They became anecdotes, quiet reminders that certainty is a luxury, and history is full of systems pretending they're more precise than they are. Now, as we drift onward, we're going to encounter a different type of execution failure, one that involves medicine, because when execution moved from ropes to science, it didn't immediately get better. It just got more confident, and confidence historically is dangerous. So take another slow breath, let your thoughts wander, and when you're ready, we'll move forward to the era where execution became modern and still didn't work properly. This is where we begin to slow things down even more. No new twists, no surprises, just the long, quiet realization that even when history tried to improve itself, it mostly just changed outfits. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, governments started to feel a little embarrassed about how messy execution had been. Hanging was unreliable, crowds were rowdy, survivors were awkward. So naturally, the solution was not to stop executing people, but to do it scientifically, because science fixes everything, obviously. Enter the era of humane execution, electric chairs, gas chambers, lethal injections, calm, clean, orderly, at least in theory. Now, let's talk gently about what actually happened. When electricity was introduced as a method of execution in the late 19th century, it was advertised as fast and painless, because that sounds nice. What it turned out to be was inconsistent. Early electric chairs were experimental, voltages varied, timings were guesses. Some people died quickly, some didn't. There are documented cases of people being shocked, declared dead, and then showing signs of life, breathing, movement, heart activity, which caused once again that familiar historical problem. The person had been executed, publicly, officially, and yet they were not done. In most of these cases, officials simply tried again, more voltage, longer duration, because by this point, the state was no longer interested in ambiguity. The ritual had changed. Now survival was not a sign of divine will. It was a technical error, and technical errors are corrected quietly. Now, lethal injection was supposed to fix all of this. Clean chemicals, measured doses, medical precision. Except, human bodies are complicated. Drugs interact unpredictably. Dosages fail. Veins collapse. Timelines stretch. There have been modern cases where people were declared dead, only to show signs of consciousness minutes later. And each time, the response has been the same: proceed, because by now, the system does not tolerate the idea of survival, which is an interesting contrast. Earlier societies saw survival as a problem. Modern societies see it as a malfunction, but the outcome is the same. No one wants to talk about it. Now let's gently bring this back to where we started. William Duell, 16 years old, executed for stealing clothes, survived, exiled, forgotten. He lived at a time when survival embarrassed the system enough to force compromise. Anne Green lived at a time when survival, witnessed by the right people, could still mean mercy. Later generations, not so much. As methods became more advanced, tolerance for error shrank, which is ironic. The more confident execution became, the less forgiving it was of human unpredictability. Now, here's the quiet truth that makes this entire story oddly peaceful. Most of the people who survived execution didn't feel triumphant. They didn't feel chosen. They felt tired, confused, hurt, and very aware that life could end without warning or permission. They didn't become heroes. They became footnotes. And footnotes are perfect for bedtime because they remind us that history is not a straight line. It's a series of uncomfortable pauses, moments where the system hesitates, shrugs, and keeps going. Now, if there's any gentle takeaway here, not a lesson, just an observation, it's this: death, historically, has been less certain than we pretend, and authority has always relied on confidence more than accuracy. Execution was never about certainty, it was about closure, and when closure failed, history simply looked away. William Duell didn't come back to life to change the world. Anne Green didn't survive to inspire reform. John Smith didn't refuse death to make a point. They survived because bodies are stubborn and systems are imperfect, and that's it. No dramatic ending, no final revelation, just the soft realization that even something as absolute as death has always been negotiated. So as we let this story fade out, let your thoughts drift, let the names blur together: William, Anne, Margaret, John, people who died, and then didn't, and then quietly disappeared again. We're going to talk about a civilization that kept throwing festivals, collecting taxes, and crowning new rulers, even as the foundations beneath them quietly crumbled. Think of it as watching someone meticulously dust a sinking ship. It's oddly relaxing, in a tragic sort of way. Now imagine waking up one morning as a member of the ruling elite, adjusting your silk robe and preparing for a busy day of issuing edicts, hosting dinners, and congratulating yourself on another successful tax collection. Meanwhile, if you looked outside, you'd see crumbling walls, starving farmers, and a military that hadn't marched in years. But of course, they didn't notice, because why acknowledge obvious collapse when you can have another festival, right? That's the vibe here. Our story begins in the late stages of what we'll call the ever fading empire, a place whose name, even centuries later, carries the faint aroma of incense, bureaucracy, and general denial. The emperors and empresses of this realm had a remarkable skill for ignoring all signs of impending doom. They had courts brimming with advisors, ministers, and yes men, but somehow no one quite pieced together that their infrastructure, economy, and international reputation were quietly disintegrating. Let's take a stroll through their world. One of the most notable figures in this story was Emperor Theodoric III, a man of average height, slightly portly, with a penchant for gilded slippers. Theodoric III had a personal hobby that would resonate with anyone who enjoys pointless ritual. He spent approximately 3 hours a day inspecting carpets, not for quality or cleanliness, mind you, but for aesthetic satisfaction. Now you might think that's trivial, and yes it is, but in a way it perfectly illustrates the mindset of the court. There were plenty of pressing matters: rebellions on the borders, treasury deficits, even the occasional peasant revolt. But carpets, as it turns out, were more pressing. And so, Theodoric III would wander his palace halls, trailing his fingers along silk and wool, entirely oblivious to the growing chaos outside. Of course, no empire fails without the cooperation of its bureaucrats, and the ever fading empire had an abundance of them. Ministers who were officially responsible for grain distribution were in practice more invested in elaborate paperwork rituals. They created charts, ledgers, and diagrams, some of which were truly beautiful, the kind that would make any modern designer sigh in admiration, but none of which actually ensured that grain reached the hungry populace. So while the palace banquets overflowed with roasted meats, bread was sometimes rationed to a mere handful per citizen. But again, why worry? The paperwork was impeccable. It's also worth noting that the empire's military leadership had a similarly detached approach. Generals, many of whom had never set foot on a battlefield, were more concerned with ceremonial armor than strategy. Parades, drills, and elaborate salutes were meticulously practiced. Every feathered helmet was polished to perfection, every cavalry horse groomed until its coat gleamed like polished walnut. If an enemy ever appeared, well, perhaps they could simply admire the pageantry from a distance before realizing the army's readiness was, shall we say, theoretical. Let's float over to another royal disaster, the marriage politics of the empire. Dynastic alliances, in theory, were meant to strengthen borders and secure loyalty. In practice, they provided endless entertainment for historians. Princes and princesses were often wed at ages that today would seem absurdly young, with little thought to compatibility or health. And unsurprisingly, many of these unions produced children who were, for lack of a gentler word, genetically unfortunate. Eyebrows would meet in courtly disapproval. Whispers circulated about that unfortunate resemblance to great uncle Ferdinand. And still the wedding ceremonies continued, lavish and oblivious to the underlying dysfunction. Even cultural projects weren't immune to this slow motion decline. The ever fading empire commissioned enormous murals, libraries, and public fountains. Some of these works were genuinely impressive, grand halls painted in meticulous detail, statues carved with astonishing skill. But as the artisans worked tirelessly, they did so while the population around them suffered from famine, taxation, and disease. It's a peculiar contrast, really, absolute artistic beauty thriving atop societal collapse. There's something calming about it in a grim sort of way, like watching a clock tick beautifully even as the house burns. Now, it wouldn't be entirely fair to describe this empire as incompetent. They were, in fact, quite consistent, consistently ignoring reality, consistently indulging in luxurious ceremonies, consistently maintaining the illusion of stability. One historian, writing centuries later, called them architects of denial, which is perhaps harsh, but not entirely inaccurate. They had long traditions of administrative rigor, martial display, and intellectual pursuit. And yet, all of it gradually failed to matter because they were, quite simply, doing the wrong things at the wrong time. Emperor Theodoric III, our carpet aficionado, had a charming habit of keeping a trouble diary. Each day, a minister would report issues like a collapsed bridge, an uprising in the northern provinces, or a shortage of grain, and Theodoric would carefully log them, add a short, polite comment, and move on to the next day. This diary, historians discovered much later, is both fascinating and painfully anticlimactic. You can see the empire's decline in a gentle slope, measured in ink and polite marginalia. It's almost meditative to read. Problem noted, solution deferred, next problem noted, solution ignored, and so on, for decades. And so, life continued. Courtiers polished their shoes, musicians practiced in echoing halls, and citizens adapted to shortages as best they could. Festivals were held as if each celebration might somehow stave off collapse. Every emperor, every noble, every minister participated in this elaborate theater of normalcy. And in a sense, it worked, up to a point. The empire persisted for centuries, slower than any rational assessment would predict. It was a triumph of denial, ritual, and routine. All right, let's pause here, gently. Take a deep breath, perhaps stretch a little if you're sitting too stiffly, and let the image of carpet inspecting emperors, meticulous ministers, and ceremonial armies settle in. In the next part, we'll wander further into the quiet personal lives of these rulers, their peculiar obsessions, dynastic quirks, and the subtle tragedies that unfolded behind palace doors. You'll meet more characters who, in their own sleepy, deliberate way, helped an empire drift toward the inevitable, all while sipping wine and adjusting their wigs. Quiet corridors of the ever-fading empire. Last time, we wandered through halls of silk carpets, meticulously polished armor, and bureaucratic paperwork that never solved anything. Tonight, we'll lean a little closer to the people behind it all, the rulers, their families, and the peculiarities that made their reigns feel oddly intimate in a tragic sort of way. Let's start with Empress Melantha II. She was known across the empire for her curious habit of collecting porcelain birds. Not just ordinary birds, mind you. She wanted birds that looked exactly like real ones, perched in unnatural poses, frozen mid-flight, or singing eternally in her private chambers. Every morning, she would inspect each one, sometimes spending hours rearranging them in precise formations. The court found this harmless enough, though a little strange, and historians today call it a metaphor for the empire itself. Every bird perfectly placed, yet life outside continued to wobble and decay. Melantha II's marriage was equally instructive. She was wed to Emperor Theodoric III, our carpet enthusiast. Their union was politically convenient, socially admired, and from what letters suggest, emotionally awkward. Theodoric often forgot anniversaries, and Melantha's letters hint at mild exasperation rather than passion. Perhaps the empire will notice our feelings one day, she wrote once, and then went on to catalog the arrangement of her porcelain collection. It's hard to imagine a more emblematic partnership, external order masking internal detachment. Meanwhile, the emperor's younger brother, Prince Casimir, had an obsession with timekeeping. He commissioned dozens of clocks, each ticking slightly differently, some with musical chimes, some with bells shaped like miniature saints. Casimir believed that by controlling the perception of time, he might influence the empire's fate. Of course, no one asked why, and perhaps no one really cared. But in the quiet hours of the night, you can imagine the palace alive with hundreds of ticking clocks, all slightly out of sync, as if the empire itself were breathing irregularly. Now, children in royal households were a slow-motion tragedy, observed with fascination by contemporary chroniclers. Young princes and princesses, often isolated from the broader world, were raised with strict rules, heavy education, and endless ceremonial expectations. One princess, Sophia, famously had a tutor insists she practiced bowing at least 43 times per day while memorizing the family genealogy back to some rather obscure ninth century duke. Sophia's diaries, fortunately, survive in fragments, revealing boredom, frustration, and occasional mischief. Today, I pretended the tutor was a tree, she wrote, and no one noticed. It's a quiet rebellion, almost imperceptible, but somehow comforting. Even in empire wide decay, there were little acts of life. Let's drift over to another oddity: the empire's obsession with titles. Ministers were elevated to obscure offices, each with ceremonial robes, sashes, and a very specific set of responsibilities, none of which had practical application. There was the keeper of the left handed fans, the overseer of unused candlesticks, and the inspector of unopened letters. Each role was recorded with exacting precision, and appointments were treated as high honors, but function mostly symbolic. And perhaps, in the grand scheme, that was the point. Appearances mattered more than outcomes, and what better metaphor for a society ignoring its own slow decline than elaborate ceremony for trivial positions? Speaking of appearances, palace banquets deserve a mention. They were staggeringly elaborate. Dishes arrived in sequence over several hours, sometimes days for the truly decadent feasts. Chefs, sourced from distant provinces, were renowned for creating pies stuffed with unknown meats, sauces of such complexity that the recipes required their own scribes, and sugar sculptures that rivaled the architecture of minor cities. Meanwhile, the common folk outside were adjusting to rationing, mild famine, and increasingly irrelevant imperial decrees. It's a delicate irony, culinary sophistication reaching impossible heights while structural collapse went unaddressed. And of course, no empire would be complete without eccentric hobbies for every rank of the elite. Ministers practiced miniature swordplay with silver daggers. Empresses painted flowers that did not exist. And courtiers trained parrots to recite poetry in at least 3 languages, none of which they fully understood. The palace was a floating island of distraction, perhaps intended to mask the slow, silent erosion of civic order. One of the most quietly tragic figures was young Prince Alaric, son of Theodoric III. Unlike his siblings, Alaric was painfully aware of the empire's decline. He scribbled notes in secret, documenting shortages, border skirmishes, and social unrest. But as a child, his influence was negligible. His observations, preserved in private journals, read like gentle sighs. They dance while the walls crumble. I can do nothing, and so I count the days instead. It's a melancholic meditation, and in many ways the emotional heart of the empire's story. The collapse was imperceptible in daily life, yet always present in quiet, observant minds. Marriage arrangements continued to reflect the empire's detachment. Daughters were betrothed to foreign princes whose names no one could pronounce, sometimes in territories that no longer fully existed. Dowries were meticulously calculated, often in precious metals, livestock, and exotic fabrics. The reasoning, often forgotten even at the time, was ceremonial rather than strategic. Borders shifted, armies dwindled, and yet the empire clung to the illusion that dynastic contracts could secure stability. It's like painting a crumbling wall in gold. It looks impressive for a moment, but the cracks remain. And then there were the rituals of mourning. Every death in the royal family prompted elaborate ceremonies, weeks of observances, intricate mourning clothes, daily readings of genealogical scrolls, and, in some cases, theatrical fainting by courtiers. These rituals were designed to honor the dead and reassure the living that the empire's moral and social order remained intact. In practice, it often masked the quiet realization that lifespans were short, heirs were few, and succession was increasingly complicated by infirmity and genetic quirks. Even religion played a role in the empire's peculiar rhythm. Temples and shrines were constructed in lavish detail, sometimes out of proportion to the actual population practicing devotion. Priests were well fed, often well paid, and expected to deliver sermons that reinforced obedience, patience, and the quiet acceptance of inevitable decline. It's hard not to see a certain irony here. Divine order preached from halls built with wealth, extracted from an increasingly struggling citizenry. Let's pause for a moment and let all of this settle. Imagine yourself wandering those palace halls, porcelain birds on shelves, dozens of unsynchronized clocks ticking in the background, courtiers reciting poetry to parrots, and a faint smell of roasted meats lingering from an endless banquet. The empire is alive, in a sense, but its heartbeat is slow, irregular, and almost imperceptible. Its citizens and rulers alike float through routines designed more to distract than to sustain. In the next part, we'll explore the empire's final decades, its attempts at reform, quiet rebellions, and the small but telling ways in which the empire's denial began to fracture. We'll meet new characters, more eccentric rulers, and watch as subtle changes ripple through a society unwilling to face the truth. It will be gentle, slightly melancholy, and perfectly suited to a calm, sleepy evening. If you've stayed cozy, perhaps with a soft pillow or warm tea, let's continue our slow journey through the ever-fading empire. So far, we've wandered through halls of porcelain birds, ticking clocks, and ceremonial banquets, glimpsed royal obsessions, and traced the lives of rulers who mostly ignored reality. Tonight, we drift closer to the final decades, the subtle cracks, the minor reforms, and the quiet unraveling of an empire that still refused to wake fully. By this point, the empire's infrastructure was fragile, to put it gently. Bridges sagged, aqueducts leaked, and roads were increasingly potholed. In theory, engineers were on the job, but in practice, the funds were often redirected toward new palaces, elaborate fountains, or commissions for another series of portraits of ancestors whose names even the family sometimes forgot. It's almost soothing, in a melancholic way, to think that while society faltered, the elite kept perfecting the illusion of grandeur. Emperor Theodoric III's successor, his rather inattentive son, Emperor Julian I, attempted a few minor reforms. Julian was a man of slow motion, both literally and figuratively. He issued decrees to modernize the tax system, improve grain distribution, and repair military barracks. But his methods were painstakingly procedural. Meetings took weeks, memoranda piled up, and enforcement lagged months behind reality. One minister noted dryly that Julian's reforms were like trying to patch a leaking ship by polishing the deck, which is both accurate and slightly comforting if you enjoy quiet irony. Meanwhile, the population had developed a kind of resigned adaptability. Farmers learned to store grain privately, citizens memorized the most up-to-date decrees, and merchants operated in a liminal economy, aware that official rules often lagged years behind practical needs. Life went on quietly. Children grew, adults aged, and festivals continued, perhaps more for reassurance than celebration. One could almost imagine the empire as a slowly spinning carousel, beautiful but creaking at every axle. Julian the Bowers himself had a peculiar obsession. He collected maps of neighboring territories, not to strategize or defend the borders, but to admire the artistry and calligraphy. Each map was carefully framed, catalogued, and displayed in the palace's map room. Historians later called it an exercise in aesthetic imperialism. Perhaps it's an appropriate metaphor. The empire surrounded itself with representations of power and order, while reality outside the palace walls was quietly dissolving. Family dynamics during these years were delicate. Princesses were married off to foreign nobles, whose titles sometimes outlived the lands they governed. Princes studied military strategy, but rarely saw a battlefield. Tutors were instructed to focus on etiquette, poetry, and polite conversation over practical knowledge. Meanwhile, Empress Livia, Julian's wife, took up embroidery depicting every emperor from the past century, including those whose reigns had been catastrophically short. This practice was apparently soothing, a way to weave history into the present, stitch by stitch, while the empire outside continued its gentle descent. Even military matters were largely ceremonial. Battalions trained in the palace courtyards, drilling in elaborate formations, polished uniforms gleaming. Occasionally, minor skirmishes occurred along the borders, but the responses were slow, methodical, and often delayed until the enemy had lost interest. The army's focus remained on presentation and perhaps somewhere morale. It's difficult not to appreciate the quiet absurdity. Soldiers perfected their drills for opponent, who never came. Economically, the empire began experimenting with subtle fiscal adjustments. Coins were slightly debased, taxes restructured, and trade encouraged through small incentives. But enforcement remained inconsistent. Smugglers, merchants, and local authorities often interpreted these reforms at their leisure. It's a pattern repeated across decades, initiative slowed by protocol, idealism thwarted by bureaucracy, and ultimately, the system continued to function in a kind of dreamlike limbo. Cultural life remained surprisingly vibrant. Art, as music, and literature thrived within palace walls and urban centers. Composers wrote slow, melancholic symphonies. Poets chronicled daily life and courtly intrigue with precision. Painters produced portraits so meticulous that the subjects occasionally complained about being too perfectly captured. While society outside faced shortages and administrative confusion, these cultural endeavors were a kind of soft resistance to entropy, a gentle insistence on beauty amid quiet decay. And of course, no empire survives its last decades without intrigue. Gossip flowed through the corridors. Who was allied with whom? Which minister misfiled important letters? Who secretly opposed new decrees? But even intrigue was slow, polite, and largely ceremonial. People whispered in soft tones. Journals recorded minor frustrations, and consequences, if they arrived, were measured and deliberate. It's the kind of intrigue that lulls rather than excites. One of the most telling indicators of decline was the subtle reduction in population. Urban centers slowly emptied, rural areas became semi-autonomous, and distant provinces felt ever more distant. The empire's rulers, of course, remained largely unaware. They continued to celebrate victories, imagined or minor, host festivals, and issue titles to officials who never arrived to claim them. The theater of governance continued, serene and methodical, while reality outside quietly reshaped itself. And yet, In this slow unraveling, the empire displayed remarkable resilience. Centuries of routine, hierarchy, and ceremony meant that even as resources dwindled, society retained enough coherence to avoid sudden collapse. Food shortages were mitigated by local adaptations. Minor rebellions were addressed with diplomacy and gifts. Bureaucratic inertia became a stabilizing force. The empire's death, if it can be called that, was gradual, imperceptible, and strangely elegant in its persistence. As we drift toward the end of this part, consider the quiet lessons of these last decades. Rulers obsessed with aesthetics over practicality, children raised in ceremonial isolation, ministers and generals perfecting appearances while ignoring reality, and a population adapting with patience and ingenuity. It's a slow motion study in denial, persistence, and the human capacity to continue despite obvious decline. In the next part, we'll explore the final acts of the empire, the last rulers, the ceremonial gestures that outlived their purpose, and the soft, almost imperceptible ways in which the empire's story concluded. It will be gentle, reflective, and perfect for this calm, bedtime atmosphere. As we continue, imagine yourself reclining in a soft chair, perhaps with a warm drink nearby, as we drift through the final years of the ever fading empire. The story is no longer about dramatic battles or shocking betrayals. It is about subtle gestures, quiet decisions, and an almost poetic decline that stretched across decades. By the time the last rulers took the throne, the empire had become a shadow of its former self. Palaces were still polished, tapestries hung in careful order, and court ceremonies continued with mechanical precision. Yet the population outside had shifted. Provinces operated semi autonomously, communication lagged, and the once imposing armies had shrunk to modest ceremonial units. It's a peculiar state, outwardly grand, inwardly fragile, balanced on decades of routine and denial. The final emperor, Marcellus II, was a man of reflective temperament. He spent hours in his private library reading chronicles of past dynasties, comparing them to his own empire's peculiar survival. Marcellus had a gentle sense of irony. He often noted in his diaries that we are like a ship with no captain, yet somehow still afloat. And indeed, the empire drifted quietly, neither expanding nor collapsing, merely existing in an extended contemplative pause. Marcellus II's personal habits were emblematic of this period. He enjoyed slow walks through the palace gardens, observing ornamental fountains, perfectly trimmed hedges, and statues of emperors long gone. He commissioned new works of art not for glory, but for calm, soft depictions of landscapes, still life studies, and portraits of family members who rarely visited. The aesthetic focus reflected the empire itself, surface beauty maintained while structural integrity quietly eroded. Court life remained detailed and ceremonial. Ministers attended daily briefings that often lasted hours, discussing reports that were sometimes years old. Ceremonial robes were cleaned meticulously, sashes aligned perfectly, and scrolls recited with careful intonation. Guests were received according to elaborate protocol, with bows and curtsies measured precisely. In many ways, the palace was a haven of order in a world that had begun to operate without strict oversight. Meanwhile, the population adapted in subtle ways. Trade networks became informal, local leaders assumed responsibility for tax collection, and festivals shifted focus from imperial celebration to communal enjoyment. Citizens quietly adjusted to autonomy, aware that the empire's attention was slow, intermittent, and largely symbolic. Daily life, surprisingly, continued without major disruption, sustained by human adaptability and the inertia of long established social norms. One of the final gestures of the empire was its ceremonial acknowledgement of tradition. Every death in the royal family was observed with precise rituals. Crowns were cleaned, portraits commissioned, and letters sent to distant nobles. Even the smallest details mattered. Ministers drafted meticulous instructions on mourning attire, ensuring the proper alignment of sashes and the correct tone of formal announcements. It was theater, of course, but comforting theater, offering reassurance to those who remained engaged with the empire's rhythms. Education and cultural life persisted. Children of minor nobles studied literature, etiquette, and art, often under tutors who emphasized patience, decorum, and observation over practical skills. Music and painting flourished quietly. Composers wrote slow, reflective pieces that's designed to be played in palace halls or quiet town squares. Painters created landscapes and still lifes that, in their calmness, mirrored the empire's steady, gentle decline. Interestingly, some scholars argue that this slow unraveling allowed the empire to avoid violent collapse. The gradual withdrawal of central authority, combined with localized adaptation, produced a soft landing for many citizens. Rebels and opportunists existed naturally, but they were largely absorbed into existing structures or ignored by a court preoccupied with ceremonial precision. It's a lesson in patience, inertia, and the subtle persistence of routine. In private quarters, Marcellus II maintained a modest hobby. He compiled journals documenting minor social changes, unusual weather patterns, and the everyday habits of courtiers. These notes, often written in tiny, neat script, provide modern historians with an intimate portrait of a society slowing down without abrupt disruption. He wrote without urgency, without panic, and without expectation of immediate impact. Perhaps, in his calm approach, he embodied the spirit of the empire itself, enduring, reflective, and quietly fading. As the final decades passed, the empire's outward rituals became its lasting mark. Festivals, coronations, and formal banquets persisted, even as the economic and political framework relied increasingly on informal local networks. The visual and ceremonial spectacle maintained the illusion of authority, while the practical functions of governance quietly adapted. It's almost hypnotic to imagine layers of silk, polished floors, and polite discussions continuing as the world outside reorganized itself. Eventually, Marcellus II's reign ended, as all reigns do. He passed quietly, leaving behind a palace full of portraits, clocks, porcelain birds, and meticulously organized records. The empire did not vanish suddenly. Provinces continued to function. Citizens maintained routines. Merchants traded. Local leaders issued decrees. The ever fading empire, true to form, concluded not with a bang, but with a sigh. Its final act was a slow fade, a gentle drift into history, leaving behind monuments of beauty, minor eccentricities, and the quiet, reflective chronicles of lives lived in ceremonial denial. And so, as we close our meditation tonight, consider the empire's story not as one of failure, but of persistence. Its people endured, its rituals continued, and its aesthetic sensibilities thrived even as power shifted and attention waned. There is something calming in the notion that an entire civilization could continue, gracefully, even as the foundations beneath it gradually gave way. It's a testament to human adaptability, patience, and perhaps the quiet charm of doing the wrong things consistently for centuries. Take a deep breath now. Let the visions of ticking clocks, porcelain birds, ceremonial robes, and polished floors settle in. The ever fading empire rests, and so can you. The ever fading empire has drifted for centuries, its rulers polite, its citizens adaptable, its culture quietly persistent. In these last moments, we don't witness dramatic collapses or heroic acts, just the calm, almost hypnotic echoes of a civilization that refused to notice its own decline. In smaller towns and provinces, life continued with soft routine. Markets opened on time, children played in streets, and local festivals quietly replaced imperial spectacles. Tax collectors made their rounds, often improvising, while merchants adjusted prices to accommodate shortages. It was slow, careful, and entirely human. The empire lived not through decrees, but through the persistence of everyday life. The final rulers, descendants of Marcellus II, maintained the ceremonial pageantry one last time. Coronations, feasts, and letters were produced with exacting precision. Yet, practically speaking, these gestures were largely symbolic. The empire's power had become more about tradition than enforcement, more about appearances than action. And perhaps that was fitting. Historians today describe this quiet fade as graceful decline. There were no dramatic invasions, no catastrophic disasters. Instead, the empire slipped gently into history, leaving behind art, architecture, meticulous records, and a collection of peculiar stories about rulers who polished carpets, collected porcelain birds, and obsessed over perfectly synchronized clocks. The legacy is a soft, reflective one, a reminder that civilizations, like people, often continue long after their vitality has quietly waned. We are going to talk about a war that, strangely enough, didn't start with a grand battle plan, a bold conquest, or even a very clear motive. No, this one began with something far less dramatic: miscommunication, misunderstandings, and the stubborn inertia of governments that frankly should have known better. Now, you might be imagining generals shouting orders, cannons firing, or troops marching with flags fluttering in some cinematic haze. Not here. Instead, picture dusty government offices, confused diplomats, and a series of letters that no one really read very carefully. That's where this particular conflict found its roots. It all began in a small, relatively unremarkable region in Europe. The geography isn't crucial here, except to note that it was bordered by two slightly larger, somewhat distracted neighbors. Both of them had armies, sure, but their attention was mostly elsewhere, on things that seemed important at the time: tax collection, courtly gossip, the occasional festival. But life, as always, has a way of nudging history along whether anyone pays attention or not. So one morning, in a fairly ordinary office with creaking chairs and dusty ledgers, an official made a small error. It wasn't intentional. Nobody was being malicious. Someone misread a name in a report and assumed that a certain border town had been occupied by the wrong troops. This could have been caught, of course. A memo could have been sent, a question asked, but instead, the misreading was forwarded up the chain of command, where it grew, as such errors often do, into an entirely different story. By the end of the week, a minor misunderstanding had become an urgent report. Enemy forces are moving into our territory, it claimed. The language was confident, Though slightly vague, there was no evidence presented, and no one actually checked the borders. But that's rarely stopped governments before. Diplomats were dispatched naturally. These individuals were, in theory, trained to prevent conflict. They were meant to ask questions, verify facts, and when necessary, gently remind everyone that the world was not actually falling apart. But in this case, the diplomats themselves misunderstood each other. One ambassador, writing hurriedly, described the situation in terms that were technically accurate but contextually misleading. Another copied the report without question, and so the narrative solidified. An incursion had happened, aggression was underway, and something had to be done. Meanwhile, back in the border town, life continued as usual. Farmers tended to their fields, merchants argued over prices, children played in the streets, entirely oblivious to the mounting tension. There were no invading armies, no sieges, just a slight breeze, the occasional rooster, and the usual complaints about taxes. But this detail was, unfortunately, lost on the people now making decisions hundreds of miles away. The leaders involved were, by all accounts, reasonable men, or at least men accustomed to thinking themselves reasonable. They were, however, also deeply invested in appearing decisive. To hesitate, to question, or to request additional information could be interpreted as weakness. So instead, they began to prepare for war. Troops were mustered, supplies were gathered, and strategies were outlined on paper. None of these actions were in response to any real military threat, but rather a perception carefully constructed by misread documents and hasty assumptions. And here's where it starts to get truly interesting, or sleepy, depending on how you're approaching this. The actual war, when it eventually began, was not the result of passionate patriotism, a sudden attack, or centuries of rivalry. It was the result of administrative momentum. Once the wheels of government began turning in a certain direction, they were difficult to stop. Orders were issued, communications were sent, and generals, those weary men who preferred long walks and quiet libraries, found themselves obeying instructions they might otherwise have questioned. To add to the complexity, there were factions within each government. Some individuals were hawkish by nature, eager for glory or profit. Others were cautious, preferring negotiation, but their voices were drowned out in the growing chorus of urgency. And so, what started as a minor misreading slowly escalated into mobilization, and mobilization inevitably leads to engagement, if only because armies are expensive and sitting idle for too long is considered wasteful. Let's float over to the first skirmishes. The initial encounters were largely accidental. Troops bumped into each other on the outskirts of small towns, exchanged nervous greetings, and then, for reasons lost to time, fired a few rounds. These skirmishes were minor and inconsequential from a strategic perspective. Yet each minor clash was reported back to the capitals as evidence of ongoing hostility. The narrative confirmed itself. Yes, the other side had attacked. And so, each subsequent report carried more urgency, more anxiety, more implicit blame. An interesting aspect of this war, from a calm historical perspective, is the remarkable absence of actual planning. Maps were consulted, plans drawn, and orders written, but very few people stopped to ask, why are we actually doing this? The original incident, the misread memo, had faded into obscurity. It didn't matter anymore. The war was now real, because enough people believed it to be so, and once belief solidifies into action, reality tends to follow. Now, as you drift further into this story, it's worth noting the human element. People on both sides of the border were not villains, nor were they particularly heroic. They were ordinary men and women, caught in a bureaucratic current that none of them fully understood. Letters went missing, messengers were delayed, and every small misunderstanding multiplied the confusion. It's quite remarkable, really, how persistently humans can act on incomplete information when under pressure. And yet here we are, observing the calm unfolding of a war that nobody truly intended. And of course, there was diplomacy. Somewhere, in a quiet room illuminated by candlelight or perhaps early gas lamps, a few diplomats realized the absurdity of the situation. They understood that the original cause of the war had been essentially a clerical error. But by this point, their voices were polite suggestions amid the thunder of marching boots. Governments tend to have a peculiar stubbornness once conflict is underway. A single misread document can create momentum stronger than reason itself. Meanwhile, life at home continued with its usual blend of tedium and quiet suffering. Peasants grumbled about taxes, merchants worried about their stock, and aristocrats fussed over trivial etiquette, perhaps oblivious to the fact that young men were being mobilized hundreds of miles away because someone misread a name. It's an ironic contrast. For most people, nothing had changed, and yet the machinery of war had already begun to hum, softly but inexorably. Let's consider the generals for a moment. These men were competent in some respects, but rarely in the kind of competence that prevents a war sparked by a typo. They read reports, gave orders, and occasionally frowned in confusion. They also relied on precedent. If the report says it's an attack, one might have thought, then I must prepare accordingly. And so, troops were drilled, weapons polished, and supply lines established, all to respond to an event that never actually happened. The first few months of this accidental war were by most accounts uneventful. Armies stared at each other across rivers and hills. Occasionally, shots were fired. Sometimes, supplies were misdelivered. There were minor misunderstandings and plenty of internal grumbling. Yet the war persisted, largely because no one had taken the time to verify the original incident. The momentum of administration, once set in motion, is difficult to stop, as we have seen. Over time, the war developed its own rhythms. Seasonal campaigns were planned, new generals appointed, and treaties discussed in theory, if not in practice. Civilians continued their lives as best they could, largely detached from the slow bureaucratic escalation unfolding at the top. And here lies the subtle tragedy. People were being affected by a war that, in essence, never needed to exist, created entirely by a chain of small errors, assumptions, and the inexorable pace of government. We have arrived at a gentle but significant realization. Wars are not always the result of passionate hatred or grand strategy. Sometimes they begin quietly with a misread name, a misplaced letter, or a single inattentive official. And yet, once started, they acquire their own logic, their own rhythm, and the quiet, sleepy gears of history turn inexorably forward. So as you settle further into your chair or pillow, consider the curious elegance of an accidental war. It's a reminder that even the most mundane errors, when amplified by human systems, can produce surprisingly sustained outcomes. History, as it often does, has a sense of irony that is best appreciated slowly, in a calm voice, with gentle pacing, and without the expectation of drama. All right, so now that we've seen how the war got started, largely thanks to paperwork, confusion, and a healthy dose of bureaucratic inertia, we can drift into what came next. The first campaigns of this accidental war were in essence an exercise in futility, but an extremely thorough and methodical one. Armies marched, cannons were polished, and flags were unfurled, all while the original reason for mobilization was quietly fading into the background like the dust in a rarely cleaned office corner. Troops were gathered from towns, villages, and occasionally from reluctant farmers who looked at the recruitment officers as if they had grown a second head overnight. These men had been told that the other side had invaded or threatened our borders, depending on which report they read. Nobody provided concrete details because, frankly, there weren't any. Still, discipline was expected, and discipline was given in that very slow, grudging way that people often do things they don't fully understand. The generals overseeing the marches were competent, in a fashion which mostly meant they could count to 1,000 and ensure that soldiers didn't get lost on the way to the wrong town. Orders were written with the usual mix of formal language and subtle exaggeration. Advance carefully and beware the enemy lurking in the hills, one memo might read. Now, there weren't any enemy soldiers in the hills, but the wording conveyed seriousness, and seriousness is important in war, even if misplaced. And so, men trudged over muddy roads, carrying heavy packs and occasionally grumbling about how this all seemed unnecessary. They encountered small logistical problems, such as missing food supplies, ill-fitting boots, and a tendency for horses to refuse to do anything useful. Each minor setback was reported back to headquarters with a flourish that suggested both urgency and existential dread, which is to say, everyone involved took it very seriously, even though it was, in fact, mostly pointless. Meanwhile, the diplomats, those quiet, candlelit figures who understood the absurdity of it all, continued their attempts to intervene. Letters were written, dispatched, and occasionally misdelivered. Some were ignored entirely, while others were read and misunderstood. It seems human communication, especially under the weight of national pride, has always been prone to gentle catastrophe. Suggestions for peaceful resolution were politely acknowledged but largely discarded, as inertia, once started, resists correction. The first engagements were similarly anticlimactic. Troops encountered one another in open fields, stared at each other for long periods, and occasionally fired a few rounds. Skirmishes were reported as battles, minor injuries were described as heroic feats, and the overall sense of panic was mostly imagined. Casualty reports trickled in, often exaggerated because who doesn't like a little drama in official documents? There was also the curious matter of timing. Campaigns were scheduled according to seasonal norms: spring for mobilization, summer for engagement, autumn for minor offensives, and winter for, well, generally complaining about frostbite and poorly constructed tents. And so, even though there was no real strategy or objective, the war developed a predictable rhythm. Soldiers marched, camps were set up, and commanders made notes in their journals about the state of operations, which mostly involved noting that it was hot, muddy, or boring. On the diplomatic front, there were intermittent attempts at negotiation. Letters carried polite but increasingly desperate suggestions for peace. Perhaps we might clarify the original incident, one diplomat ventured, or maybe verify the reports before committing entire armies, another proposed. These suggestions were, unfortunately, polite enough to be ignored without offense, and thus the cycle continued. Mobilization created engagement, engagement created reports, and reports reinforced mobilization. A loop, simple yet stubborn, emerged. Interestingly, civilians in nearby regions had a completely different perception. For them, daily life continued almost unchanged. Farmers harvested crops, merchants sold their goods, children ran through the streets, and the aristocrats debated fashion, trends with the usual intensity. Occasionally, a traveler or courier would bring news of the marching armies, but these reports were received with a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance. Most people were far more concerned with taxes, rents, and the weather than with an accidental war unfolding slowly in the countryside. Let's pause for a moment and consider the generals again. These men were perfectly capable of organizing armies, issuing orders, and maintaining discipline, but they were, as humans often are, occasionally impatient with uncertainty. The lack of a clear enemy objective frustrated them. Advance to where? One might have asked. Why? Another might have inquired. Their answers were limited to vague reports and increasingly imaginative interpretations of distant memos. And so they improvised. Improvisation, when combined with authority and large groups of confused men, is surprisingly effective at sustaining a war. There were also smaller personal dramas that added color to the otherwise dull progression. Officers argued over supplies, couriers fell asleep on duty, and a few soldiers accidentally camped in the wrong village. A minor quarrel over who had the better boots escalated into a temporary standoff between two companies of soldiers. Nothing violent occurred, but the incident was documented meticulously in logs that no one would ever read again. It's a subtle reminder that even in times of unintended conflict, human pettiness continues unabated. And then came the propaganda, or what passed for it. Leaflets were distributed, proclamations were read aloud, and official announcements carefully exaggerated the nature of the enemy threat. Of course, the enemy itself was largely imaginary. Sometimes reports conflicted. "We are under siege," one document claimed, while another, from just a few miles away, noted that the countryside was quiet and nothing had happened. But contradictions mattered little. Once a narrative of war takes hold, it has a momentum of its own. Meanwhile, the original border town, where it all began, remained entirely mundane. Farmers tilled their fields, merchants argued about prices, and local officials wondered why so many strangers were wandering around with helmets and confusing paperwork. One local innkeeper, observing the soldiers marching past, muttered to himself, "They've clearly lost their sense of direction, but at least they brought extra bread." And he was right. The bread was unusually plentiful that week. By the time the second campaign season rolled around, the war had developed a slow, predictable rhythm. Letters continued to circulate, orders were issued, and the troops followed them obediently. Some soldiers began to question why they were even there. Others found small comforts, the same routine each day, predictable camp chores, and the occasional accidental victory against imaginary enemies. The war had become, in a sense, a feature of life rather than a crisis. It's worth noting that from a strategic perspective, this war was highly inefficient. Resources were misallocated, supply lines meandered without purpose, and no one achieved any lasting advantage. And yet, from a human perspective, it was rich with subtle, almost poetic irony. Generals acted decisively on assumptions, soldiers obeyed orders without question, and diplomats attempted to intervene in vain. The world moved forward calmly, predictably, and yet entirely absurdly. And so, Part 2 concludes with a slow, gentle observation. Wars do not always start with purpose, nor do they always proceed with clarity. Sometimes they are the product of minor errors, human stubbornness, and administrative momentum. The first campaigns of this accidental war were not heroic. They were not particularly bloody. They were instead quiet, deliberate, and utterly real. As you settle further into your chair or bed, consider the curious elegance of human systems. Even in their mistakes, even in their inefficiencies, they produce outcomes that are both inevitable and strangely mesmerizing. In the next part, we will drift into the middle period of the war, the awkward negotiations, the bureaucratic entanglements, and the slow, unremarkable, yet persistent continuation of hostilities. So we have arrived at the middle and final stages of this unusual, entirely avoidable war. By this point, armies had marched back and forth more times than anyone could count without really caring, and generals had perfected the art of issuing orders with complete confidence that nobody would understand, or perhaps that everyone would follow blindly anyway. The diplomats, those patient souls who understood the absurdity of the whole affair, continued their gentle attempts at reason, though it's fair to say their impact was limited. History, as always, had its own plans. The middle years of this war were defined largely by stalemate. Troops camped along rivers and hills, occasionally skirmished in minor, almost accidental encounters, and generally tried not to fall asleep during roll calls. Supplies continued to be misdelivered, and letters continued to be misread. Sometimes, entire companies would be sent to the wrong village, which caused confusion, minor quarrels, and one very memorable incident involving a cow that refused to be herded. Interestingly, morale was surprisingly stable. Soldiers had adapted to the slow pace, finding solace in daily routines, cleaning weapons that weren't needed, polishing boots that were already spotless, and meticulously documenting events that no one would ever read. It's a curious human behavior, this tendency to assign purpose where none exists. And yet, in this war, it was the only thing keeping everything moving. Diplomatic efforts persisted, as quietly and politely as ever. Letters suggesting peace, clarification, or verification of facts were sent across the border. Some were intercepted, others delayed, and many ignored. On occasion, a cautious suggestion reached a general who nodded sagely, as if he had considered it, before filing it away with other minor notes. Bureaucracy, it seems, has its own kind of inertia, which can sometimes surpass even the physical movement of armies. Meanwhile, the civilian populations, those people entirely unrelated to the original misread memo, continued their lives largely unchanged. Markets functioned, festivals went on, and children played in the streets. Occasionally, a weary soldier would wander into town, ask for directions, and return to his camp slightly more confused than before. To them, the war was a background hum, a faint inconvenience rather than a dramatic event. And perhaps that was the most remarkable aspect of the whole affair. A full scale, years long mobilization with almost no impact on everyday life. By the final years, the war had developed a predictable pattern: minor skirmishes, intermittent logistical disasters, occasional quarrels over tents, and endless polite, largely ignored diplomatic notes. Generals wrote reports filled with confident phrases like, "The enemy shows signs of stubborn resistance," while observers could see that the enemy was largely doing the same thing, marching in circles, polishing weapons, and occasionally wondering why they were even there. One of the more amusing elements was the development of what historians now call accidental tradition. Certain regiments became known for particular quirks. One would always set up camp facing north, even though it made no difference. Another insisted on singing slightly off key while marching purely out of habit, and yet another kept careful logs of cows that wandered into encampments. These minor details, utterly irrelevant to strategy or outcome, became the defining characteristics of the war. The war also inspired a number of minor innovations, none of them particularly practical. Engineers experimented with small bridges that led nowhere. Generals tried maps that were only partially accurate, and one particularly ambitious officer attempted to build a signal system using flags, lanterns, and pigeons. None of these efforts made a meaningful difference, but they did provide distraction, which in a war largely devoid of purpose was a valuable commodity. Eventually, the original cause, the misread memo, the non existent incursion, was formally discovered, though not in the dramatic, climactic fashion one might imagine. A clerk, leafing through dusty archives, noticed the discrepancy and mentioned it quietly to a superior, who mentioned it to another superior, who filed it in a report. Slowly, very slowly, someone realized nothing actually happened. No border town had been invaded. No troops had crossed boundaries. It had all been accidental. The realization didn't immediately end the war. Momentum, as we've seen, is a powerful force. But once the bureaucratic wheels turned fully in the right direction, peace began to take shape. Treaties were drafted in careful, overly polite language. Troops were gradually recalled. Logistics officers, having grown fond of routine, complained mildly but accepted that it was time to stand down. And so, quietly and without fanfare, the war ended. The soldiers returned home, somewhat confused but otherwise intact. Civilians continued their lives as if nothing had happened, though some probably wondered why so many strangers had wandered through their towns carrying packs, boots, and minor grievances. Diplomats quietly retired or moved on to other, slightly less absurd conflicts. And the generals? Well, they filed their final reports, carefully documenting every minor incident, every logistical hiccup, and every cow that wandered into camp. They were, as always, thorough. Looking back, historians tend to regard this conflict as a remarkable example of human systems operating with minimal oversight. A single clerical error led to years of mobilization, thousands of miles of marching, and countless reports, all for a non-event. It's a story that gently reminds us of the quiet power of bureaucracy, the inertia of institutions, and the human tendency to follow orders even when logic suggests otherwise. And perhaps that's the final, lingering thought. Not every war is dramatic, not every battle is decisive, and not every conflict changes the world in obvious ways. Some wars exist in the shadows of paperwork, in the quiet corridors of administration, and in the slow hum of human habit. They are, in their own way, entirely fascinating, not for their heroics or their battles, but for the subtle absurdity of human endeavor. So, as you drift further into calm contemplation, imagine armies marching in circles, generals nodding wisely at reports that say nothing, diplomats writing polite letters, ignored by everyone, and civilians living quietly, entirely unaffected. It's a gentle reminder that history is not always grand, not always bloody, and not always meaningful in the way we expect. Sometimes history is sleepy, bureaucratic, and quietly ironic. And sometimes that's exactly what makes it worth listening to. This isn't going to be thrilling. That's the point. It's calm, it's slow, and it's about watching an entire place fade, almost imperceptibly, from life into quiet. The cities are funny in a way. They're supposed to buzz with energy, right? Streets full of movement, markets alive with bargaining, children's laughter ricocheting off brick and stone, street lamps flickering on at dusk, and someone somewhere always losing their keys. But what happens when all that stops? That's the story of this particular city. Let's not name it yet. It doesn't matter. Names are irrelevant when the cobblestones themselves seem to hum in ghostly tones. Imagine waking up one morning and noticing fewer carts rattling across the plaza, fewer voices in the taverns, and fewer lanterns glinting through fogged windows. One day, you might see a familiar baker still kneading dough at the corner shop, but the street outside is silent. Even the usual stray dogs are somewhere else, probably judging the new emptiness. And so it begins. Slowly, almost lazily, the city exhales, and then it stops. Let's float over to the city's history a little. It had been once modestly bustling, not Paris or London, too much prestige there, but respectable enough. A river curled lazily through the town, bringing trade, and a market square that doubled as a gathering place for announcements and occasional arguments about whose goat was the loudest. There were inns, of course. Every city had them. Rooms rented nightly, filled with weary travelers, merchants, and sometimes philosophers, if one fancied the occasional debate over tea or ale. The city's rulers, for what they were worth, were generally competent. A mayor here, a council there, people who wore robes and hats and occasionally made decrees no one really understood. Their main goals were keep the roads passable, tax the markets, and ensure that at least on paper, the city remained alive. But life, as we're about to see, has its own stubborn inertia. By the 18th century, the city's growth had begun to plateau. This was not dramatic. There were no wars that ripped it apart, no plague sweeping through in a single terrifying wave. Nothing so cinematic. It was simply gradual. Families began moving away, mostly for economic reasons. Trade routes shifted slightly to the north. A river bend that had been convenient for unloading goods suddenly became less so. And with each small shift, the rhythm of life slowed imperceptibly. Businesses started to close one by one. The baker mentioned earlier, he moved to a nearby town. The blacksmith followed, then the tailor. Each departure left a faint echo in the streets, like the last note of a piano gently fading into the air. Soon, it became hard to find fresh bread, or a shirt that fit properly, or a horseshoe for that one persistent donkey no one really liked anyway. But people adapted because humans are stubborn that way. They adjusted their lives to shrinking conveniences, and in doing so, unknowingly participated in a very slow, very quiet vanishing. Schools were next. It's funny, really. Children are supposed to give cities life, right? Their running, shouting, and occasional tantrums make a town feel awake. But as families left, schools struggled. Eventually, the youngest students were being taught in private homes. By the time the mid 19th century rolled around, the main schoolhouse, once a hub of chatter and paper scraps, sat empty, doors closed, the bell swinging gently in the wind, waiting for students who would never come. Even the church, which one might expect to cling to tradition and keep people gathering, slowly emptied. Clergy members either retired or moved to livelier congregations. Sermons were delivered to fewer and fewer attentive ears. By the 1870s, the main church could be described as quiet, in a way that wasn't respectful, but noticeable. Echoing pews, dust motes in the sunlight, and the occasional cat that had taken up residence. Somehow, the spiritual heart of the city was in tune with its general drift toward silence. Of course, not everyone left at the same time. Some stayed, stubbornly, almost as if daring the city to vanish without their witness. You can imagine these residents, an old innkeeper, polishing a counter for nobody in particular, a solitary librarian, cataloging books that few read, a grocer, keeping the shelves stocked more for ritual than profit. They became living monuments to a city that was slowly forgetting its own pulse. And there's an irony here that should not be lost. Cities are meant to feel eternal. People expect streets and bridges to remain, even if everyone else goes. But this city, as we'll see, was more ephemeral. Buildings started to crumble, roofs sagged, windows cracked, moss crept across stone steps. Yet the city didn't collapse dramatically, like some ruinous tragedy. It simply wore itself down, like a sigh, and the longer it lingered in this semi-sleep, the more it seemed almost peaceful. There's something gentle about this kind of decay. No loud explosions, no dramatic betrayals, no lightning-struck disasters. Just the soft, inevitable passage of time. And humans, being creatures of habit, tend to notice the loud stuff more than the quiet. Which is why, when someone eventually walked through the empty streets, they might have remarked, "It's almost beautiful here." And they would have been right, because there's a certain calm in emptiness, a rhythm in silence, and a subtle poetry in watching life slowly step aside. Of course, there were oddities, because there always are. Stories circulated of windows mysteriously opening at night, or a lamp flickering without wind. Children born elsewhere would occasionally peek in through streets still lined with shuttered houses, trying to imagine a bustling town. Travelers passed through, looked around, and muttered about the ghost town feeling. But it wasn't a ghost town in the haunted sense. It was alive in its own quiet way, alive in absence, alive in memory, alive in what had been and what would not return. And so we settle in with these early impressions. A city slowly withdrawing from life. Streets once busy with human chatter now only host the occasional stray cat or wind-blown leaf. Markets once vibrant with haggling now host only pigeons. The hum of daily activity replaced by the hum of air through empty corridors. And as the sun sets and lanterns stay unlit, the city exhales one final lazy breath, as if preparing for sleep, a sleep that it might never wake from. It's tempting to wonder why people didn't intervene. Why not invest? Why not attract trade? Why not convince the last few stubborn residents to stay? But of course, life doesn't operate on shoulds. Economics shifted, people drifted, and small choices compounded over decades into something much larger than anyone's intentions. It's a reminder that history sometimes isn't about wars, kings, or revolutions. Sometimes history is just quiet. And with that, we'll pause tonight on the city's early drift towards slumber. The foundations remain, the streets remain, and the quiet thickens. But we haven't even touched on the individuals who stubbornly stayed behind, or the slow, gentle changes that would define the city's long nap. That will come next. So settle in. If you're still awake, maybe stretch a little and allow yourself to drift into the soft rhythm of history's quieter side. The city awaits, and as we continue, we'll wander through abandoned markets, quiet churches, and the slow, almost imperceptible fading of a community once vibrant with life. So we left off with a city that had begun to drift into quiet slumber, its streets mostly empty, markets silent, and buildings slowly settling into their long, lazy decline. But of course, there are always exceptions. People are stubborn. Life is stubborn. And so, some residents refused to leave. They stayed behind, not because the city was thriving, far from it, but because they had roots, routines, or perhaps an attachment that bordered on the irrational. Take, for example, the old innkeeper. He had run the central inn for decades, inheriting it from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather, and so on. The inn had once been filled with laughter, the clatter of dishes, and the occasional argument about the fairness of a coin toss. Now it was largely quiet. Guests were rare, and the innkeeper had adjusted accordingly. He polished the tables, swept the floors, and refilled the shelves out of habit more than necessity. Occasionally, a traveler might appear, perhaps lost or curious, and he would greet them warmly, offer a room, and then return to his silence. Then there was the librarian. Libraries are peculiar in sleepy cities. They tend to linger long after most people have left, because the books themselves are patient. The librarian spent days cataloging, dusting, and rearranging tomes that few, if any, would read. He took comfort in order, in the soft scratch of pencil on paper, in the gentle weight of history contained in leather-bound volumes. There was something almost meditative about maintaining knowledge in a place where there were so few to absorb it. And of course, there was the grocer, perhaps the most quietly tragic of the remaining citizens. He stocked shelves, kept produce fresh, and adjusted his inventory to suit the rare passerby. He would sometimes speak to no one at all, muttering about supply chains and market trends that no longer applied. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a merchant, in a town with almost no customers. And yet, he persisted, because leaving seemed almost like abandoning the city itself. These holdouts, as we might call them, became the unofficial custodians of memory. They preserved routines, maintained structures, and kept some semblance of continuity in a city otherwise drifting toward oblivion. And in doing so, they developed habits that could only exist in a near empty environment. For instance, the innkeeper would sometimes set two tables for a meal, imagining guests who would never arrive. The librarian read aloud to the empty hallways, letting the echoes fill the spaces where people once lingered. The grocer would tally imaginary sales, occasionally glancing at empty shelves as if expecting a customer to appear around the corner. Life moved differently here. There was no rush, no urgent appointments, no overcrowded markets or frantic travelers. Instead, there was an almost ceremonial pacing. Days were marked by the sun crossing the sky, by the slow rotation of shadows across cobblestone streets, and by the quiet rituals of the few who remained. Even small events, a flock of birds settling on a roof, the distant bark of a dog, a gust of wind rattling a shutter, became notable, noteworthy, almost significant. And yet, despite the calm, the city wasn't entirely static. It continued to change, imperceptibly but inexorably. Roofs sagged a little further, paint peeled from doors, and moss began claiming walls. Streets that were once swept daily started accumulating dust, leaves, and the occasional discarded object, a shoe, a child's toy, a piece of broken pottery. Nature, in its slow and deliberate way, was reclaiming the city, adding its own subtle music to the silence. Some of the holdouts found solace in documenting these changes. Diaries, letters, and journals appeared, chronicling life in a city that few would ever visit. The innkeeper wrote daily observations about weather, shadows, and stray visitors. The librarian recorded the arrival and departure of birds and small animals. The grocer made meticulous notes on inventory adjustments, even when there were no customers to account for. These records were quietly heroic in their own way, a testimony to persistence, to continuity, and to the small dignity of maintaining life in the face of inevitable decline. And then, of course, there were the children, or rather, the absence of them. The city's youth had long since moved on, drawn to schools, opportunities, and livelier streets elsewhere. Their absence created an odd sort of emptiness, one that was particularly noticeable during evenings. No laughter drifted through alleyways, no playful disputes echoed off walls. Even the occasional mischief of a child, skipping stones, chasing cats, drawing on walls, was gone, and in its place, silence, soft, continuous, and oddly soothing. It's worth noting that the holdouts were not uniformly melancholic. Some found charm in the quiet, the ability to move without crowds, to enjoy an uninterrupted walk down streets that once required patience and tolerance. They discovered small pleasures that urban life rarely allowed: uninterrupted reflection, uninterrupted observation, and a profound intimacy with the city itself. In a way, the city had become a private retreat, a sanctuary for those who could appreciate the subtleties of near empty streets, the slow dance of sunlight and shadow, and the delicate balance of memory and decay. Of course, this lifestyle had its quirks. One might see the librarian talking to a stray cat as if it were an assistant, or the innkeeper arranging chairs in unlikely patterns to please the ghosts of guests past, or the grocer talking aloud while rearranging tins and jars, recounting what business was like back in the day to the empty air. These were not signs of madness, at least not in any dramatic sense. They were signs of adaptation. Humans are remarkably flexible, especially when life offers no alternatives. The city itself seemed to respond to these few residents. Streets felt calmer, air felt heavier, and the occasional sound, footsteps, a cart creaking, a door swinging, echoed in ways that might have seemed eerie elsewhere, but here felt natural. Buildings that might have seemed dilapidated in a crowded town now took on character, their cracks and moss growth almost decorative. The city had learned to sleep lightly, aware of its few caretakers, and in turn, they learned to move in harmony with it. Economically, the city was practically non existent. Trade had dwindled to almost nothing. Markets, once bustling with merchants, had become gardens or occasionally storage for personal use. Roads that connected to neighboring towns became secondary paths, overgrown and occasionally forgotten. Even postal service had faded to a trickle, and yet the remaining residents carried on as if these changes were entirely normal. And in a way, they were. When there's no audience, performance becomes ritual and routine becomes the measure of life. As decades passed, the city's semi sleep became more pronounced. Buildings aged gracefully or ungracefully, depending on one's perspective. Roofs caved gently, chimneys leaned at delicate angles, windows filled with condensation and occasionally snow. And through it all, the few remaining souls carried on, marking time, preserving memory, and occasionally chatting to themselves about the absurdities of life in a nearly abandoned place. And so, as we observe the city in this state, we see a curious blend of abandonment and care, emptiness and attention. Life persists, not in numbers or commerce, but in quiet rituals, personal attachment, and the sheer stubbornness of those who refused to leave. It is a city in liminal space, neither fully alive nor entirely dead, neither bustling nor derelict, simply existing, and doing so slowly, softly, and in a way that almost encourages meditation. This concludes our view of the last holdouts, the caretakers, the chroniclers, and the stubborn few who kept the city alive in their own quiet way. In the next part, we'll explore how the city's structures themselves began to interact with time, weather, and nature, slowly transforming from human centric spaces into something else entirely. As we continue our slow stroll through this city, it's worth pausing to look not just at the people who remained, but at the city itself, the buildings, streets, and spaces that had once pulsed with energy. With fewer humans moving through them, these structures began a transformation that was almost imperceptible day by day, year by year, and yet undeniable when viewed over decades. Roofs sagged, tiles cracked, chimneys leaned like tipsy old men at a gathering, threatening collapse but somehow managing to stay upright. Wooden beams shrank, warped, or split quietly, emitting soft creaks in the stillness of the night. Doors that once swung briskly with purpose now groaned on rusted hinges, and windows, often left open for ventilation, gathered dust, cobwebs, and the occasional feather from a passing bird. And it wasn't decay in the dramatic horror movie sense. Nothing fell apart in a single shocking moment. Rather, it was a slow, gentle aging. Buildings became softer around the edges, less rigid and more organic. Walls bowed slightly, plaster flaked in elegant patterns, and staircases sagged just enough to remind visitors, or the few remaining residents, that time as always moves steadily and quietly. Nature, as patient as ever, took the opportunity to reclaim its space. Moss crept across stone steps and rooftops. Ivy climbed walls, finding purchase in cracks and corners, weaving a green tapestry across the city. Small trees, seeded by wind or birds, sprouted in courtyards, alleyways, and abandoned gardens. Even the river, once the lifeblood of trade, began to shift slightly, sending occasional tendrils of water into places where no human foot had trod for decades. Animals became more noticeable here than they had when the city was bustling. Cats prowled freely, unbothered by anyone attempting to shoo them away. Birds nested in eaves, chimneys, and empty towers, their chirps echoing against silent walls. Small mammals like rabbits or hedgehogs found new corridors to explore, and even the occasional fox appeared, wandering curiously down streets that once had carried so much human traffic. Interestingly, the holdouts seemed to adapt alongside this transformation. The innkeeper began leaving scraps for the cats and birds, creating what he jokingly called staff meals. The librarian cataloged not just books, but birds' nests, recording their materials, location, and apparent nesting patterns. The grocer occasionally planted small herbs or vegetables, more to maintain routine than to provide actual sustenance. Life persisted in these quiet interactions, blending the human and natural rhythms of the slowly sleeping city. Buildings, streets, and even public squares acquired a sort of personality. A tilted sign above a closed shop might suggest whimsy. A crooked lamppost might appear contemplative. The once busy market square, now dotted with weeds and moss, seemed to breathe gently with the wind. Time itself became tangible in ways it never had when the city was fully awake. Shadows lengthened differently across cracked stone. The sun's warmth hit walls in patterns unobserved for generations, and the quiet allowed for noticing things that had never mattered in the rush of daily life. A particularly stubborn vine, the subtle hum of wind through an archway, the soft patter of rain collecting in gutters. As decades turned into a century, the city's semi-sleep became almost absolute. The few residents who had remained aged naturally, some passing on quietly in their beds, leaving behind records, habits, and memories. Newcomers were rare, and the city no longer existed in the usual sense. It had become a place of observation rather than action, a city in liminal space between existence and memory. Visitors occasionally wandered in, curious, perhaps historians or urban explorers, seeking the quaintness of abandoned life. They were struck by the peacefulness, the stillness, and the strange beauty of streets untroubled by bustle. Some took photographs, some wrote essays, and some, most importantly, sat quietly on a crumbling bench, letting the city's slow rhythm seep into them. By now, the city had fully embraced its sleep. Its former energy was transformed into a new kind of life, one measured not by commerce, sound, or human interaction, but by the soft dance of nature, the persistence of remaining caretakers, and the echoes of centuries past. The city had become, in a sense, a living memory. And memory, as we all know, is remarkably resilient, even when the people who once created it are gone. So, as we leave this city for the final time tonight, it's worth reflecting on the quiet beauty of slow disappearance. There is a lesson here for those of us who live in bustling, noisy places. Life doesn't always need drama to be meaningful. Sometimes, the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts, the slow fading, the gentle decay, the soft persistence of a few dedicated souls, can tell the most profound stories. And as you settle into your own quiet tonight, perhaps think of this city. Imagine walking its empty streets, feeling the sun on cracked stone, hearing the distant call of a bird, and noticing how even in absence, life has a rhythm of its own. There is a kind of peace in observing the passage of time, in understanding that not all endings are loud. Some are quiet, soft, and almost comforting. So dim your lights a little more, let your shoulders sink, and breathe. Imagine the streets, the rooftops, the moss, the quiet echo of footsteps long gone. Let the city's slow rhythm lull you, not into excitement, but into calm, into reflection, and finally into rest. Good night, and may your own world, for the next few hours, Drift as gently as the streets of this sleeping city.